It's like the desert in here with all this sand blowing around my poor shop. Dust gets in everything. But let's talk about sandblasting for a minute, because there's a few tricks that'll really help relieve the frustration and the challenges and make you effective in sandblasting. And, if you're like me, you probably got one of these little sandblasters from Princess Auto, which is the equivalent of the US Harbor Freight sort of thing. $124 30 years ago. I see they're $350 today. And they don't call them sandblasters anymore. They call them media blasters because they don't sell sand. So I picked up some media as well. Crushed glass from China. 30 to 60 grit for doing this car body. Normally you can recycle the sand, and so the trick to recycling the sand, and this will save you a lot of hassle, is to screen it every time. So it picks up on the floor. Sometimes it'll be like 3 or 4 inches deep on the floor. And it runs down the tarps and gathers at the bottom of the tarps, and so that's a good place to just scoop it up with a, some kind of whatever scooper. I use an old dustpan, and run it through the screen and back into the bucket, and then throw the garbage away. Because if you get any, bits of wood or debris or, big rust scale or, even screws or whatever going into your sandblaster, it'll plug it, and it's a nuisance. So keep the sand clean. Rule number 1. And the second thing is keep it dry. Now there's a condensation catcher on the back of the sandblaster that is to fill up with water, and then when the pressure's off, it drains out, and it works really good because I see wet stuff always running down the back of my sandblaster. And but there's so much condensation, and the reason is because you're using so much air at high pressure, and when that pressure releases, it cools the air so quickly that it forms condensation. And that condensation can make your sand wet inside your sandblaster, and then it'll plug up in the orifice, right in the bottom where it comes out of the tank and into the blaster manifold. And so there's a trick here that it took me a while to learn. And that is the way this thing's set up, okay? You run your air supply into the top of this tank and open the main valve, right? And that fills the tank with pressure, and that air comes out the hose at the same time because it's going right through, because the valve on the back of the tank is also open. You got to keep that one open at all times, just about. As the pressure in the tank is equal to the pressure at the manifold, because that hose is equalizing the pressure, when the wet sand gets stuck in your tank and it won't come through that little hole in the bottom, then what you can do is that valve on the back, you just give it a quick close and open again. And what that does is you close that, and now there's no pressure down at the manifold. The pressure's all in the tank, and it's going to force the sand through that hole and down into the manifold. And that's why you want to do it quickly, because if you do it too long, you're just going to fill your manifold up with sand, your hose is going to fill up with sand, and your whole thing's plugged. It's not easy. It's not hard to unplug, so don't worry about it. But just a quick, thump, and then it'll just give a huff of sand out there, and it'll just blow everything out. I find that works really well. So that way I can use probably half a bucket of a sand each time. If you're having trouble with condensation and wet sand, then just don't put so much sand in at a time. That's really the key. So a good air supply, of course, is a real key as well. And I happen to be using 2 5-horse air compressors. The first one back in here is a 2-stage that I bought, when I bought the sandblaster, so that's 30 years ago. And it's a 5-horse, 220 volt, of course. And I've also added this little kind of trunk, if you're thinking of elephants, nostril, whatever it is, onto the air filter of the compressor so that it hangs down and then has more fluff in the bottom of it to strain the dust, because that dust is, you can imagine, what fine ground sand would do to cylinder walls and piston rings. And so that's the one air compressor. And I used to run this sandblaster all the time with that one. And with that one, you would have to, put a tank full through, a third of a bucket usually of sand, and then stop and let the thing build up pressure again. But now I have this shop that happens to come with another 5-horse air compressor up top here, which has 3 cylinders. It's a single stage, also 220 volt, of course. And so the two of them work together. And give me an air supply that I just never run out. I've got to stop and fill up with sand more than I have to stop and let the air build up. So, but you know, it's not a problem with just one air compressor, but I would never do it with anything smaller than a 5-horse 2-stage. It would just be, too slow going. So when you're starting to blast, you hook up your air supply, open the main valve, the top of the tank there, and let the thing fill up. And you'll notice that as it's filling up, the pressure's building, the air is coming out your Sandblaster hose as well. That's the way it works. And when you start getting good pressure in the tank, you know, maybe after a few seconds, then you open the bottom valve on the tank enough to let enough sand, so that's your mixture, ratio of sand to air. And so, I don't know, it doesn't seem to make much difference. I open it a bit, I open it a lot, it works. And so you open that till you get the right amount of sand out, and you do that by looking at the sand coming out. You know, put it against a piece of rusty metal and set your sand ratio with that. And once that thing is set about right, then you can just stand up and go ahead and sandblast your parts as you go. And again, it'll last for, I don't know, quite a few minutes, probably 5 minutes or something like that. And then you got to stop, fill up with sand. The air compressors will catch up, whatever. So then the next thing is maintaining this thing, because it will blow holes in itself. So a trip down to Princess Auto, the Make It Happen store. A new hose barb, 1/2-inch nipple hose barb thing. This thing blew right out yesterday, and bought a new hose for it. And look at how much longer the new hose is than the old hose. And the reason is because every time the hose breaks off at the end or blows a hole through the sand or whatever, you know, sand blows a hole through it, you got to cut it off and cut it off, cut it off. Now I've got like, what, 16, 14 inches more hose so I can go farther. And it'll be much more flexible, which is going to make my life easier. See, sandblasting is very no comfort allowed, right? Because you got sand flying everywhere, you got all of this equipment. Oh, got an old welding helmet on, you got a rag over top underneath my beanie trying to keep all the sand out of my collar. Everything's tied right up tight, and gloves on and all that kind of stuff. And there's no way to get comfortable because it's so intense. You're just trying to get as much rust off with little time as you can, because all your sand's running out and your air compressors are running and the electric meter's whirling. And so, yeah, you just, after a while, it could get tiring. And dirty, so stinking dirty. But what happens is that the sand coming through the manifold at the bottom, right, drops out of the tank into the manifold, the air hits it and blows it through the hose. Well, right there where it blows it through the hose out of that manifold, it tends to swirl, and I don't know what it's doing in there, you can't tell, right? But you can when you see it blow a hole through the piece. So yesterday I was sandblasting, and there's this great rooster tail of sand coming up from underneath the sandblast. I'm like, okay, it's happened again.
Time for lunch. Enjoy.
I got 2 women in my life. One named Terry, one named Google. And they both got good manners. So the sand coming through that manifold eventually blows a hole through the little nipple that comes out, and the rubber hose goes over. So it's actually like a hose barb. So I ran and bought another couple of those. And basically, I just cut the old one off and clean up everything around there. Cut the new one short to the right length, and then just weld it on. Of course, you got to take the fittings off before you weld, otherwise you'll melt everything, any sealant or anything you got in there. And then, seal those fittings back up, reassemble the thing so that it's all nice and neat and tight. Make sure your valves are good. Make sure your handles have little bolts on them. I just put a new bolt on this bottom one because it falls off. And the thing is, you got to remember is, when you're sandblasting, like I say, you're covered right up and you're feeling around for things. I find myself looking for my sandblaster, but you can't look. You just have to feel your way around the garage until you find it, and then feel down below and you get that valve, and okay, I wish there's a better way. But anyway, that's the way it works. So that's the main repair, right? Is that little bottom manifold will keep popping holes through. But again, like I say, it's probably once every major project. So not a big deal. But keep a couple of these hose barbs, 1/2-inch hose barbs, on hand to weld in to replace the old one. Other than that, you know, it's pretty well clear sailing. And I would say that in a day, I could probably do a quarter of the body of this 49 Chev I'm working on. So that's a straight day of sand blasting, because you got to filter the sand, you got to move stuff around, you got to do this side, you got to do that side. And what I'll always do is I'll put a big piece down, like right now I've got the hood over here, and I put it down, and all the little pieces like the hinges and door hinges and all that kind of stuff, I put it on top of the hood and sandblast it there, so that the blast that's going beyond the little pieces that I'm doing is actually affecting the hood as well. So then when I go to sandblast the hood, it's like, hey, this is just about nearly done. And you don't want that sand like blasting against wood, because it'll just chew the wood up like crazy. So put something big, a big piece that you have to do underneath, and blast on top of that until you get all the little pieces done. And then you just blast the big piece and you're done. And then after that, you've got to prime it, and it's a good thing to put epoxy primer on. And I use the PPG one. I hear there's a lot of better ones, but this is the one I can get where I live. And so I'll put this epoxy primer, and it's expensive, $460 just for the paint. And then you got to have hardener and reducer to go with it. So do that epoxy primer, and you got to do that right away. They say once you have sandblasted steel, you got to paint it right away. Well, that's impossible because there's sand everywhere. But what I'll do is I'll do it like a quarter, and then just kind of shake the sand off and brush everything up, and then paint. I wish I had another room to paint in. That would make it so easy. Maybe I'll start painting outside, because it's going to be summer pretty soon. And then you paint that, and then it's safe. And then after that, you can put your Bondo or your plastic filler over top of the epoxy. Okay, you don't have to put in fact, it's better to put the epoxy primer on to seal that fresh steel before you put any filler on. So you put your filler on after. And if you leave it for more than a day, then you've got to scuff the epoxy primer before you put the filler on. So yeah, but then that's kind of down the road, and we'll talk about that in another video. And one more thing, if you're a sandblaster, not to mention my arm. Hey, that's way better. You're a thorough person, because this is a messy job. But I tell you what, it works better. It's so nice to work with steel that's been totally blasted, totally cleaned, and there's no rust in there, and then you seal it up. And so I would encourage you to be really thorough, to get right down to the bare metal in whatever project, whatever you're working on, because you'll be able to build it up from there, and you'll have not only a satisfactory project when you're finished, a satisfactory result, but you'll have a satisfied heart too, because you'll know that you did it the best of the best of the best. And I'm going to have some more videos coming up about how to take the next steps after you sandblast, because once you sandblast, you're going to find that taking it right down to the bottom and starting from the bottom up, you're going to discover a lot of stuff, a lot of blemishes, a lot of problems, a lot of holes, a lot of dents that you didn't even know you had in that old steel.